Everything you've heard about soldiers eating hearty meals on the front lines? Scrap it. On the battlefields of World War II, food died twice. First at the hands of logistics, then to rot and desperation. Preservation became a daily fight with mold, maggots, and decay, each ration a gamble between survival and sickness. Men survived not through supply chains, but through messy ingenuity that stretched food one more day past spoilage. The real story played out in foxholes, muddy boots, and hands pawing through tins that smelled faintly of rot. Meat sweated in the tropical heat. Biscuits turned from meals to breeding grounds overnight, while powdered eggs collapsed into corpse-colored lumps. The weather, the battlefield, and time itself worked against every scrap of food, forcing men to salvage, adapt, and often choke down meals more dangerous than enemy bullets. Staying fed was an ongoing war against relentless decay, and ingenuity was about keeping food alive long enough to be swallowed, meal after grim meal. Rot followed every convoy. On the Eastern Front, entire supply dumps soured before snow fell. In the Pacific, the jungle chewed through crates of meat within days. On the battlefield, humidity, heat, and time proved as destructive as enemy fire. Soldiers tore open cans that stank of rust. Biscuits swarmed with life after one damp night, and powdered eggs meant for endurance broke down to lumps the color of sickness. For every rifle raised, a tin was sniffed and judged. Preservation stood as the thin line separating soldiers from hunger and the sickness of spoiled food. The challenge was relentless. Any soldier who trusted the packaging or the supply line quickly found out what a single rainstorm, week of tropical heat, or lull in resupply could do. The military knew it too. The science of ration design was a constant battle. Engineers and chemists struggled to keep food edible. Tin-plated cans, powdered forms, and field packaging were tested, rejected, and reinvented as soon as troops sent word of infestations or foul taste. Rations like the C ration and K ration claimed to offer stable calories and long-lasting nutrition, but every unit on the march learned how easily the promise of preserved food broke down in real conditions. Preservation could mean drying, canning, pickling, or just stuffing biscuits into a can and praying for the best. Some rations were fortified with salt and sugar to stave off spoilage, but too much salt brought its own misery. Dry mouths in sweltering heat with nothing to drink but stagnant water. Soldiers became experts in desperation. They buried food in the cold ground, stored tins in shade, shared rumors about which brands lasted longest or which climates spoiled meat fastest. Sometimes the only protection was constant suspicion. Sniff every packet, watch for rancid fat, eat around mold. No one cared about taste anymore. Preservation was survival. Every meal carried the threat of illness. Dysentery, food poisoning, and starvation stalked the lines as surely as enemy fire. Morale sank with every ruined meal, but ingenuity surged. The will to scrape, salvage, and sometimes share last scraps became its own battle discipline. Each meal on the front became a gamble with decay, played out in foxholes and mess tents, deciding who might last another week. Preservation starts with what the factory could churn out and what the army could shove in a tin. On paper, the canned ration was a triumph. Ham sealed in metal, beans packed airtight, stew rendered shelf-stable for weeks or months. Open the can, heat it, if you could scrounge up a flame, and a meal was ready. But factory promises met frontline reality fast. Metal snapped, seals leaked, water corroded edges, and the contents inside mutated as fast as the climate changed. Cans meant to survive winter rusted apart in tropical swamps. Biscuits, dried to stone-like hardness, cracked more than teeth, soaked up humidity, then blossomed with mold. Rations engineered in neat calorie tables became something entirely different, once handed over to human hands in hostile earth. Canned meats, stews, even processed cheese spread gave hope to quartermasters. They didn't need refrigeration and could survive months on the move. But soldiers were quick to discover that long-lasting didn't mean safe. Tropical heat could turn canned meat sour overnight. Dry biscuit packs meant to resist almost anything got sticky, infested with bugs, and tasted of cardboard. Powdered goods sounded impressive: eggs, milk, coffee, but frequently arrived clumped, tasteless, or worse, spoiled by moisture before the packet was opened. Every ration, every packet, became its own little gamble, pressed as much by engineering limits as by the brutal physics of the battlefield. To compensate, armies designed rations around pure survival. The American C ration came in separate cans for meat and bread, each one crowded with accessory packs, tablets for purifying water, cigarettes, candies, even humble salt tablets to stave off dehydration and boost morale. The K ration packed paratroopers' meals into boxes tough enough for a drop from the sky, meals shrunk into concentrated blocks, canned cheese or meat, biscuits, a few squares of chocolate, dry cereal bars. These rations had to endure everything from minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit blizzards on the Eastern Front to jungles wet enough to rot boots in the Pacific. Yet soldiers argued ceaselessly over which rations they'd trade away and which ones tasted least like sawdust. Preserved rations meant survival in the strictest sense. They kept men fed, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months. But every new ration was a lesson learned of how much worse the taste became, how limited the nutrition, and how relentless the struggle to adapt a canned promise into an actual meal. Calories on paper meant little. Survival was counted in hours won from hunger, in every rusted tin that still opened. The Army's official rations were just the start. Soldiers learned that the real currency, the thing that kept them alive, was the tricks passed from veteran to recruit, from one front to another. Salting ranked first. Meat packed in heavy salt could last far longer in jungle humidity or frozen trenches. Sometimes it arrived so salted that men had to soak it for hours to make it edible, risking dysentery if their only water was filthy, but risking death if they didn't eat at all. Drying was another lifeline, especially for root vegetables and biscuits. Dried bread, hardtack, became legendary for its bone-breaking toughness, but it endured weeks in sodden foxholes and months locked in supply boxes. Soldiers dried strips of meat, spreading them over rocks or fire embers when weather allowed. Vegetables sometimes get sun-dried on rare, quiet days. To stretch out the shelf life, men tried anything: spells of sun, makeshift drying racks in damp trench huts, and even oven drying when they found an abandoned farmhouse with a working stove. Pickling carried the taste of the home front forward. Simple brines, water, salt, maybe vinegar if luck held, turned available vegetables into meals that survived the slow rot in the crate or foxhole. Russian and Japanese troops were famed for making pickled cabbage and turnips, turning leftover spoils into a batch that could last for weeks. Sometimes a single jar of pickles became the most valuable item in a squad's supply. Sometimes soldiers just buried vegetables and hoped the cold would do the job. Brine offered little in taste, but it kept food alive long enough to keep soldiers on their feet. Improvisation was everything. Some squads buried tins in the ground to keep them cool, hoping soil and shade would fight off the heat. Men draped cloth over food, wrapped packets in wax paper to ward off water, and dug makeshift wells in the cold mud as root cellars. Hunger and sickness, visible in slow-moving, hollow-eyed faces. The best methods weren't always official. They were passed through whispered stories, late-night deals traded for a chunk of bread, or the lonely hope that one more trick might mean surviving the week. In the end, preservation was never static. The lines between official, inherited, and desperate blurred. Soldiers clung to these methods, not because they brought comfort or flavor, but because every day they stretched food past another turn, past another night, past the endless drive of rot and war. The science of rations could only carry men so far. When truck convoys vanished and crates ran empty, soldiers faced survival work, stretching scraps from one foxhole, one mess tin, one cold stretch to the next. Fillers, stale bread, crushed oats, powdered potato were mixed into canned meat to make every scrap last. A can meant for one might feed three, but water was never guaranteed. Stews were thinned with melted snow or muddy puddles. Rations got divided, traded, and stretched. Small extras, chocolate, dried fruit, powdered milk, became precious. Foraged roots or potatoes scavenged from ruined fields often marked the line between food and famine. Sharing tips, how to mash, hide, or mix, became a ritual, a lifeline across platoons. Improvisation ran deeper still. Men boiled bones until they cracked, scraped bark, unearthed buried vegetables. Some hid tins underground or stashed food behind enemy lines. Rumors mattered: who'd found a potato, who had lard, who'd boiled soup from almost nothing. Meals stretched first for the wounded, then for the weary, then for all. Hunger taught discipline and solidarity. Every crumb counted. These desperate improvisations birthed rituals and recipes driven not by taste, but survival. Each bite, a patchwork of rations and scraps, was a quiet act of resistance. On the front lines of war, making food last became proof that men would not surrender to hunger, at least Not today. Preservation depended as much on alterable landscape as on ration science. Soldiers became experts at wringing every possible advantage from their immediate environment, learning that battlefield terrain was sometimes the only available resource. In colder regions, Stalingrad, Ardennes, the Carpathians, men buried cans and biscuit tins deep into the earth, trusting frigid soil as a makeshift refrigerator when official supply failed. Frozen ground was nature's best defense against rot, slowing decay for weeks, even months if luck held. Abandoned trenches, collapsed farm cellars, and bombed-out buildings became impromptu larders, reimagined as places of preservation instead of protection. Shade was the frontline refrigerator. Troops fought to stash perishables in whatever cover they could find, under roots, in tree hollows, hidden behind shattered vehicle hulls. A single patch of shade could spell the difference between edible meat and a batch of maggot-ridden disaster after a day's march. Cloth and wax paper wraps, scavenged from ration packs or looted homes, offered pitiful but vital protection from moisture, heat, and pests. Even mud became an ally. Biscuits packed in dried clay lasted longer, and makeshift mud cellars slowed down the humidity, trying to spoil every meal. Some soldiers invented their own storage solutions. A found water trough could be filled with cold spring water, converted into an overnight cache for meat or cheese. Others dug trenches lined with rocks to hold cool air and keep milk powder usable for a few extra days. Resourceful squads built crude racks suspended in tree cover, banking on the breeze to slow spoilage. No manual taught these methods. They spread through rumor, trial, and error, born of necessity. Every environmental trick came with risk. Tins frozen too deep sometimes burst. Meat hidden in mud took on the taste of dirt. Biscuits lost to rats and insects vanished without a trace. Yet these acts of adaptation were proof against surrender. Every meal preserved through shade, cold, or clever storage was a tiny victory. Another day won stubbornly against rot, climate, and an enemy that never really stopped advancing. Whatever food the army provided was useless if it couldn't survive the march, the muck, or enemy fire. Soldiers learned fast. Packaging was as vital as the meal inside. Cans, waxed paper, cardboard boxes, and cloth wraps became the front line in the fight against moisture, pests, and catastrophic spoilage. The tin-plated can revolutionized military rations, sealed tight to block water and pests, strong enough to take a beating, but always susceptible to rust, corrosion, and tropical rot. Some soldiers carried can openers like lifelines, passing them between foxholes, cursing each time they snapped on steel warped by heat. Ration boxes, layered in wax or lined with parchment, offered weak protection. Jungle moisture, foxhole mud, or freezing rain could still breach the best efforts. Frontline ingenuity filled in the gaps. Men rewrapped biscuits in extra cloth or wax paper looted from civilian homes. Paper and string, scavenged off supply crates, helped waterproof weak spots or bundle food tight for another night's march. Even battered cardboard, torn from spent ammunition boxes, was pressed into service as liner and roof for makeshift food hides. Repair and adaptation became daily routines, as essential as cleaning a rifle. Bent cans were hammered flat with rifle butts. Tins with a leaky seam were bandaged with melted wax, borrowed from candles, or stolen from rations no one liked. Rat-chewed crackers got stuffed in mud-packed bundles, pressed with rocks to keep the vermin out. When disaster hit, a lost ration drop, a heavy rain, entire squads pooled salvage, crafting impromptu larders out of helmet liners, canteen covers, mess tins, and every scrap of spare textile, rough solutions that seldom held for long. Yet in every platoon, the creative use of packaging, carrying, and repair was its own testament to survival. Keeping food safe, patching battered tins, and wrestling every half-edible scrap out of the supply line was proof again that in World War II, ingenuity mattered more than instructions, and survival was built one patch, one wrap, one battered can at a time. In the shadow of rot and rations, soldiers found ways to turn misery into shared perseverance. Tricks circulated in whispers and trades, picked up in quiet moments, desperate deals, or whispered encouragement in the middle of another hopeless meal. Any glimmer of hope, a can of jam that survived the march, a stolen method for drying bread, a way to bury cabbage for another week, became cause for celebration. Survival was always a group effort. Soldiers swapped tips on stretching dried soup or fixing spoiled meat with more salt than anyone ever wanted to taste. Morale rose and fell with every edible meal. The promise of a hot supper, even if the soup looked like yesterday's rain, could lift spirits after weeks of cold biscuits and silent hunger. Some units turned disaster into jokes, laughing at block-hard bread or sour tins, celebrating the one time someone's scavenged chocolate lasted through a barrage. Every shared trick, every bite wrung from a patch of dirt or a battered tin became a link in the chain that kept men moving forward. Ingenuity outlived instruction, and hope was carried in battered mess tins and whispered recipes. The spirit behind every preserved meal became proof that soldiers survived by pooling knowledge, adapting relentlessly, and holding tight to every scrap of optimism they could. Even when the food failed, sharing and invention held the line, reminding men that survival itself was their victory, claimed one day at a time.